impacted their operations today. Kelly, please start us off, and can you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Coster. I'm the Director of Marketing at Loom. As Roy just said, we've been here before to present with you, either myself or our CEO, Sawyer Hall. And so I'm happy to be back here again today, just multitasking here to share my screen while I talk. But my background is in transportation planning and urban planning. And then I've been at Loom almost 4 years, running the marketing team, which is very heavily based in education. So happy to be here today. I will be sharing a bit about some of the data, what we've seen with commuting trends in the past year. I will also share the findings from an employee survey we did about commuting and benefits. And then I will close with how our customers, who are employers, are actually changing their benefits, thinking about return to office, and sort of how we are supporting them in that change. So for those of you who don't know or are newer to the commission, Loom is a commute software. So we work with employers, specifically enterprise employers, tech companies, hospitals, universities, really large clients for the most part, to manage their commute program and offer flexible mobility options for employees. So software company, but it's all about bringing those policies to life that we know change behaviors of the commuters to get fewer people driving alone to work. We care about it a lot because of the environment, because of the experience, the urban congestion. Employers care about that, and they care about parking costs, which is insanely expensive in urban areas. So it's actually a huge benefit to them to have fewer people driving alone, money-wise. So that's a little context on Loom, and I will just go ahead and dive in. Feel free to drop any questions in the chat box or ask me at the end. And just for some scale, I guess, as well, we work across North America, Loom, but we're founded and we are based in Seattle. And so we work with we have about over 500,000 commuters locally, in the Seattle region that use, and across the state that use our platform for their commute benefits. There we go. So a few quick trends. I don't think any of this should be surprising to you if you've been following along, with what's been happening in the commute the past, 18, 20 months. But we've seen a 60% drop in commute trips in all of our sort of Loom data that we track across North America. The biggest dip at health companies, where there was an 85% drop in commuting. Makes sense, just like myself, I'm working from home. And then just a 20% drop in healthcare. Again, makes sense with all the essential workforce. We've also seen an increase in carpool and vanpool compared to bus commuters, especially in healthcare. So with our healthcare clients, there have been twice as many now carpooling or vanpooling compared to busing than there was in January of 2020 before the pandemic, when there was twice as many bussers as carpools and vanpools. So that's something we're looking at as we start to, adjust into our future commutes here. Are people going to stick with their carpools and vanpools, or will they return to transit? And then last kind of insight, a bit unique, biking's gained popularity across the board, but most significantly so on university campuses. This is my own, but I would assume that some of the reasons that might spike more at universities is due to budgets. If you can buy a bike, then it's free. Commute distance, a lot of college students live close, or just age and ability, right? Demographic of a college student tends to be younger, tend to be more able-bodied, and really care about sustainability. At least the ones I used to teach at UW sure did care a lot about sustainability. Gives me hope for the future. So beyond just looking at the Loom data, there are about 1,000,001 surveys about what's the post-COVID commute going to look different? How's it going to be different? There's all sorts of different findings, and there's certainly some transit hesitancy, or certainly there's a lot of people driving who we might need to change their behaviors. But I really just put this here to say that I'm not going to be talking about the post-COVID commute, because A, I don't know what post-COVID even means anymore, and if that's ever a reality for us. And B, it's just a continually changing context. And if we've learned anything in the last 20 months, it's that in different geographies around the state, in different places around the country, and just given who you're speaking to, the context is always changing around the pandemic and around commuting. So instead, you'll hear me now just talking about the future commute, and certainly taking into account what has happened in the last 20 months as far as, impacts, both positive and negative. Some of the positives that we're starting to see, of course, that transit is safe. If we could just get that message really clear to the end users, transit is safe, and it is rebounding. It is starting to rebound, which is definitely very positive. E-bike sales are booming across the country. I know my parents jumped on that e-bike train and ride their bikes everywhere now. So hopefully that is happening in Washington for all sorts of commuters of different ages and abilities. And then we know that telework is here to stay. So we know our future commute is changing. The problems that we'll be dealing with are slightly different than the ones we dealt with pre-March of 2020, but there's also a lot of opportunity there. So before I jump too far into what are the opportunities with employers, I want to give you this context to this employee survey that our parent company did. So our parent company at Loom is Health Equity. They're a benefits company as a whole. So this survey was like about all benefits under the sun. And I think it's really interesting, some of the findings I'm going to show you that seem to gravitate towards commuting as top of mind for employees. So first, context on the survey. So this was done in June of 2021. There was a national sample that was much bigger than the population of just over 1,000 that I'm going to talk about today. The reason I'm only talking about this 1,006 employees is because it's this 43% of the study who are like me, actually, are people who previous to the pandemic, I went to work pretty much every day, was in the office. Now I'm either working at home full-time or part of the time in a hybrid model. So it's those folks that changed from an in-office setting to a remote in some capacity setting during the pandemic. And so we're asking those employees how they think about various benefits and working from home. The key themes you're going to see in this data, the key takeaways really are that employees value flexibility above anything else. And you're probably gathering on that with all these massive companies like Amazon and Google who are announcing, who've always wanted people to be in the office, and they've held pretty true to that, but are starting to make announcements publicly like, okay, we're going to do a hybrid workforce, or okay, you can work remotely as long as you can commute into the office at any given day. So starting to have to sort of, all of us are starting to have to give in to that employee flexibility, especially right now as there's a great resignation happening and a lot of job moving. So second thing, remote work support is becoming increasingly important. And then lastly, this is that interesting thing, is that what really rose to the top is there's a big opportunity to improve commute experiences. So first, on this context, most organizations, 74%, say that they have plans to bring employees back to work on site, either full-time or part-time. I know Loom, as a company, we fit in this bucket. We are going back as a hybrid model. There are many other companies like that, majority, 74%. Second, 2/3 of respondents said that they want to return to the office, at least part-time. So they said either I prefer to work on site full-time at 23%, or I prefer a hybrid model at 43%. So the majority, not quite that 3/4 of the companies who want to bring people back, but 2/3 want to go back in some capacity. And then of those folks who said, I still want to work remote, either full-time or part-time, the top 2 reasons why that ranked the highest both have to do with commute. And I think this is really interesting because, again, our parent company is a benefits company. And if you look closely at this, it's probably pretty small text for you, but if you look closely, I mean, there's stuff like, I like to work from home because it's comfortable. I can wear sweatpants. Like there's stuff like family care, childcare, that's why I like to work remote. So there's a whole range of reasons why you might prefer to work remotely. And the top 2 are, number 1, working remotely saves me commuting time. And number 2, working remotely saves me commuting costs. So where we're working with our employer partners now is like, okay, well, how can you support your employees? If you are in that 75% who want to bring your employees back to the office at least some of the time, how are you supporting them on the commute? Because that's what they are most not looking forward to, dreading the most. How can you help them with time? Well, we can't always make it faster, but we can help, educate them and help them find a way to spend that time on their commute in a more productive way. If they aren't driving alone, they can, read a book, they can answer emails on the train, they can socialize in a carpool. And then especially very directly on the cost, like that's, no brainer with an employer can help on the costs because they can provide subsidies. And we're seeing more employers, a lot of employers in Washington already offer a free transit card or an ORCA card in the Puget Sound region. And that's amazing. We have a great ORCA passport program for employers and they utilize it. What we're seeing them go a step further now is actually, and I realize I'm probably jumping ahead here a slide, but oh well, I'm halfway into it. Where we're seeing them go a step further is they say, okay, we do that and we want to offer a subsidy every month that they can use for bike share, for scooter share, for Lyft Line or Uber Pool, anything that's not driving alone to work. It's a flexible subsidy that has a cap per month and they can use it and it's either auto logged or it's reimbursed through Loom, through the technology. But we recognize that there's more options than just transit and that employees have different levels of comfort or their transit route, unfortunately, maybe had to get deleted or it's not as frequent now as it was prior to the pandemic. So they're looking for these creative ways to meet people where they're at and bring them to work in a way that's not, not driving alone. And then as we return to offices, employers are really looking at this as an opportunity for change, right? We know that the best time to change an employee's behavior, a commuting behavior, is when they move or start a new job or when there is a serious disruption. I think we can all agree that the pandemic has been a serious disruption. I know for me, returning to the office and commuting again feels like I'm going to a new place, new space. It's a totally new behavior because I'm so used to walking from my bedroom to this room every day for my commute. So listening to those folks at the Harvard Business Review who do a lot of research in this, we're approaching this with our customers like it's a relocation. We know relocating is the time to change behaviors, and in a sense, we're all relocating back to our offices. At least part of the time. We're seeing a lot of focus around daily flexible choice, which is amazing. And we're seeing people really adopt the hybrid workplace. So my last section here just dives into a bit about how employers are actually changing their benefits, what we've seen in this last year. Amazingly enough, even during the pandemic, when no one's commuting, as a commute company, we still grew and we still added new customers, a lot of essential workers, but also those companies that know they're going to bring their employees back in a hybrid workplace and realize that they really do need these flexible benefits. First and foremost, starting with daily parking. That is the biggest one. Makes my my transportation heart flutter, because we know and have known for a long time that the way to change behaviors is to get rid of monthly parking permits. Monthly parking permits are a sunk cost effect. And if I've already invested resources in a monthly permit, I am going to drive every day, and I'm going to keep with that behavior because I've already invested resources in it. I'm going to get the most out of it. Doesn't matter what carrots you offer me and incentives to take another mode. I've already invested resources. I'm going to keep with that status quo. So we know that switching to daily parking charges from a monthly parking permit has a huge impact. Specifically, if we look at our own customers pre-pandemic who switched from a monthly permit to a daily parking permit, there was on average a 12 to 15% reduction in drive alone rates in the first year. So huge impact right there. This is different scales. I want to note different scales of prices, because some people charge full rate for the monthly permit and full daily market rate for the daily permits. Some subsidize that at different levels, but I just looked at all of our customers who have made that switch. When did they make that switch? What was their drive alone rate before, after, and a year later? And we found that around a 12 to 15% reduction in drive alone rate. Some more, some less. So we're really excited that this hybrid workplace model is sort of forcing companies to make this change to daily parking, forcing them to, since their employees are only coming to the office a couple days a week, you can't say to your employee, okay, pay for a parking permit for 20 days a month, but only come in 5 days a month. It doesn't work. So it's really creating that impetus for making the switch to daily parking. Beyond daily parking, we're seeing as well a focus on reservations, both in parking. So actually, just like you might reserve a desk, like a hoteling at your org, you also reserve a parking space or a spot on your shuttle. There's definitely looking at more creative ways to manage demand in a hybrid workplace model. And then this is what I mentioned before about the flexible subsidies, but we're seeing a lot more promotion of either carpool apps, ride share, bike share, scooter share as like a first last mile option. We're seeing people customize that subsidy based on whoever the employees are or where they're located, and just giving as much choice and flexibility to the end commuter as they can, which is great. And then lastly, we're seeing a big focus on biking and walking more than normal, like focus on education, focus on rewards and tailored, like targeted communications, but ways to get folks who have maybe picked up cycling during the pandemic, just like for fun around the neighborhood, trying to get them to come into work that way as well. We just launched a case study with our neck of the woods here, Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. They were one of those who during the pandemic, during the height of it, when at the beginning there, when everyone was driving into work and we were telling people not to go on transit, they started, wanting to offer parking for all their employees. They had a big demand issue. So they started working with us. They realized they needed to switch out of monthly permits to daily permits. And so they've been able to do that. And what's been really neat about it is it's sort of been the foundation, the starting point for them building out a holistic, flexible commute program that is looking forward to their hybrid workplace that they're going to implement. Yes, even at a hospital, they still have a ton of administration staff, and they're planning a hybrid workplace where they don't have to be in the office every day. So they're looking at how they can make all their other benefits now flexible at a daily level, not just the daily parking, but that is the crux there. And if you're interested, I believe this is my last slide here. We're doing a webinar next week with Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. So anyone's welcome to tune in at 11 a.m. And I can share the link in the chat. Excellent. That's all I've got. thank you for having me. I guess I don't know if you ask questions now or later, but I'm here to answer them if there are any.
You're muted, Roy.
I'm muted. Let me do this again. Are there any questions?
This is Hester. I have a quick question. Thanks, Kelly. It's a great presentation. And I think the last stuff you focused on around the switch from monthly parking to daily parking, given new schedules, is really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. And I'm wondering if you're seeing the same type of shift, not just in employer-owned parking lots, but kind of broader, like commercial lots, and both wanting to see that happen and also thinking about things like the commercial parking tax and impacts to that.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, Hester. What we're seeing as far as so the employers that we work with, some own their own parking, super easy. They make the change to daily, they own that garage, done. A lot of people don't own their own parking and it is leased. And so actually what is happening when they want to switch to daily parking is that they're going to a parking operator or garage and saying, hey, I know you like to sell us monthly permits or passes, or you only like to sell us like one access device for one car, like one person. And they're trying to get them to change that model and change their mind. I'd say in Seattle, we have decent luck. I would say in other less urban areas, and especially in just different parts of the country, that's actually really hard. And there's a bit of an old school mindset and just like, well, this is the way I've done it and I have guaranteed income. And they've got a great revenue income for parking operators, right? Because they could sell you the spot. You don't show up, they'll sell it to somebody on the street so they can double book it. So that's definitely a challenge we're facing. We collectively, employers and people who lease parking. And what we've seen is successful is when multiple employers sort of team up and say, well, we all lease parking in this garage and we all are moving to a hybrid workplace and we need daily parking. So sort of like forcing the hand of the garage owner or operator to change their model. But it's a challenge you just pointed out for sure.
Any other questions?
Sure, I had a question.
Carl.
Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for the presentation. One potential challenge I've heard is that as companies are relying more on a hybrid model, that they may be less willing to pay for a full 20 days of transit use by their employees participating in those commute programs. Is that a downside or a challenge that you're seeing with companies, or is there another approach to that?
Well, one example would be like Seattle Cancer Care shared when we just did a presentation for WISRO, Washington State Ride Sharing Organization Conference. And what they shared is like one of the ways they're changing that, because they used to charge a certain fee, heavily subsidized for the end user, but they used to, the employee, but they used to charge a fee per month for transit cards. And now they realize if they're only coming in 4 days a month, maybe 1 day a week, like that charge is actually more than it would just cost them to maybe pay the $275 to get on the bus. So they're making it zero. So I don't think that answers your question as the employer, because they're willing to pay for that no matter what and pay by use in the passport program. Where we're seeing more like issues with that is in other places in the country that don't have as great of a program, like the Orca passport program for businesses, where you can charge by usage, where they actually make that election up front or pay for the whole month rather than paying for how much you use.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Other questions?
And I see a question in the box from Luis. Does Loom consider evaluate intercity passenger rail, e.g. Amtrak Cascades, as transit to be studied and measured? We do regional rail as a method of commuting, like the Sounder. That's definitely one, and there are a lot of people we know in the Seattle area commute that way. Amtrak Cascades I've never seen that one as a commute mode, but I suppose if someone took a commute mode, they would probably just select regional rail for that one as well, even though it's a very big region.
Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, thanks everyone for having me.
Now we'll hear from, my screen moved, from Justin. Please introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Justin Layton. Before I get started, I need screen sharing ability. There we go. Perfect. My name is Justin Layton. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington State Transit Association. I appreciate the opportunity to come before you once again and talk a little bit about public transit in the state of Washington. I presented to this group in July of 2020. I had to remember the time just doesn't exist anymore, doesn't it? In pandemic time. What is ironic back then is I believe I was asked to come in July of 2020 and talk about the post-pandemic world. And I believe I was very distinct in not saying that we were in a post-pandemic world. At the time, we were on our first downslide of a wave. I have a little bit of a slide about that. Some of this presentation kind of re-goes over a lot of what I talked about, as it's still pertinent today, because as the previous speaker said, we are not through this pandemic yet, and we need to stop pretending that we are and stop saying post-pandemic when really that has not been declared over yet. So I'm happy to share with you some thoughts and some data that I've collected for this presentation. A little bit about the Washington State Transit Association. We provide public education and outreach, advocacy of positive and effective public policy, and collaboration and professional development for public transit employees. We were formed in 1981. In fact, next month we will be celebrating 40 years as an official association. However, should note that an informal grouping of transit agencies have been working together since the late 1960s. We have 31 members from our largest member, which is King County Metro, about $1 billion operating budget, to our smallest member, Garfield County Public Transportation, with just an operating budget of just a hair over $300,000 a year. They are all part-time employees, employee count of 5. Combined, our members provide, before the pandemic, over 240 million annual boardings, and cover about 86% of the state's population for access. And we'll get into ridership a little bit later. I talked a little bit about this, and some of this is still relevant. It's important to remember that COVID-19 pandemic is not over. We are still in a response and recovery mode at the same time. Many of the measures here are still being conducted, daily cleanings. I always often joke with some of my friends, the bus has never been cleaner. The bus was safe to ride before, the bus is still safe to ride, and the only difference is it's actually getting cleaned every single day. A lot of agencies most agencies went to zero fare. A lot of that has to do is creating distance between the driver and the passenger, and it's also a lot less items to clean. Think about all the money that goes into the fare box and having to handle that after the fact. I'll talk a little bit later about what agencies or how many are still not collecting fares at the time. Rear door boardings, driver barriers, reduced service levels, balancing between essential and non-essential riders, pandemic leaves, and food and medicine deliveries. These are all items that most agencies did and are still continuing for some of our members. Kind of a little bit about what we were doing. We were doing what is not natural, which is telling people to not get on the bus. It is a very much a problem for us when we say don't come on the bus, but we wanted to be part of the solution, not the problem. We kept service on the streets because of the essential workers. I noticed in the previous speaker's slide that only about 20% of the healthcare workers were going. I'll show you some ridership statistics through the pandemic. That makes sense. We saw only essential trips, individuals, frontline workers who are essential to keeping the economy moving, continue to ride our services. And driver barriers, I just put a picture here. A lot of agencies could not procure driver barriers, so their maintenance departments hand developed and built their own barriers. I'm still working on it before. Most transit agencies in the state didn't have barriers prior to this. Some vehicles just didn't work well with a barrier. If you've ever been in the Central Puget Sound riding one of those large MCIs, maybe to the airport, those are very hard to put a barrier on. There's not a lot of room. So shower curtains were actually used, the clear plastic kind that you would buy for like 99 cents at the dollar store, were being used to help protect our workforce. There's a kind of a video there, just shows essential trips only. For our part, the association, which is every single public transit agencies, we actually delivered well over 130,000 face masks to 40 transit agencies in 3 different states. We have and still hold weekly or every weekly calls with our general managers, small mid-sized agencies, frequent meetings with different work groups. Still to this day, there are several emails in our distribution list that ask questions about how are each agencies responding. What are they working on? How are they solving XYZ problem? We're serving as a clearinghouse for agencies. The top line takeaways, moving into the impacts, they're deep and long lasting, both ridership, revenue, and the workforce. I'll get to the workforce problem in a minute. Revenues remain unpredictable, and therefore it's very hard to budget and plan for. We've all had this problem. If you could imagine that your paycheck was different each pay period, significantly lower, higher, be very hard for you to budget and plan for. And that remains the case for agencies. Uncertainty with ridership needs and trends make for a harder plan. And we just heard the speaker before us talk about the trends of commuting specifically, and what that looks like. We have a lot of companies say they're coming back online, but they're, when, how many, and who really is a problem. So it's been very difficult for our members to plan for the services to put on the street. And of course, workforce shortages struggle across the organizational chart. That has been going, and it's actually more of a problem after the reopening. It's not just about drivers, it's mechanics, it's planners, it's HR folks. The workforce out there, there's more jobs open than people applying for or qualified people apply for. Revenue impacts, I always do this, and Rima knows this, I always want to make sure it's important that we understand how transit is funded. Transit is funded through local sources majoritarily. That's 87% of sales tax and fares. The federal source is about 10% on average. This is across the state on average. And the state is only 3%. I repeat to the Transportation Commission, the state only provides 3% of our funding. In fact, only about 2.5% of the state transportation budget actually goes towards public transportation. Sales tax revenues fell by nearly 20% statewide at the very beginning, 20 statewide and 25% in the Puget Sound. We have to remember that the large counties, Snohomish, Pierce, and King, went into the pandemic first, and they're the ones that kind of left out. So their impact has been a little longer and a little deeper for folks as well. Fares fell by 80 to 100%. Most agencies just went flat out zero fare for a long time. And in some cases, some agencies have not brought those fares back yet. And some are actually electing to do a pilot program and not bring them back at all for a year or two to see how that works. And of course, the Federal Relief and Recovery Plan assists in keeping the doors open, and still do today. There are 3: CARES, CRISA, and ARPA. Love all the acronyms that come out of Congress, especially CRISA. It's kind of a cute little name. Here's what that did for us. Federal Government Relief and Recovery Act. As we remember, if all of us can just remember that far back of March 2020, when we all went into lockdown, Congress acted very quickly, and in that was transit funding nationally, and about $700 million came back to Washington State Transits. The CRISA Act was December of 2020. not quite a year ago, and that was 752 that came back to transit agencies here in Washington State. And the American Recovery and Protection Act, ARPA, was March of this year. And that was $1.1 billion. I have details of where and what agencies that went to. I'm happy to answer those questions offline or later about what those funds did. Those funds are majorly going to paying the operating bill. Most of it went to just keeping the agency running. Very few of it went to actual capital dollars. Some elected to, and as the CRISA and ARPA funding, the majority of that was focused on urbanized areas and less in the rural areas, as the urban areas needed more funding to recover from their revenue loss. So I presented this exact slide in July of 2020. I think it's very important to see how fast and swift the impacts that COVID had on our ridership. In the first 30 days, we saw a 75% reduction in ridership. I put some notes in there about when Governor Inslee declared a state of emergency, when they started banning gatherings in the large counties, when the schools started to close, and then, of course, when we went into lockdown. This is just another look back in the first 4 months. We saw the cliff really have there. In fact, our lowest ridership day since March 30th of 2020 was April 23rd, when we hit the rock bottom. Negative 76% of our ridership wasn't there. That tells us that about 25% of our trips, we were still providing for essential workers. It really does match what the previous speaker talked about, healthcare workers, people needing to go to their appointments. Just because there's a pandemic doesn't mean you can miss your dialysis appointment, for example. That has to continue. And a lot of folks were still needing to go get their groceries who are transit dependent. We have to remember, not everybody has access to a working car, and that is why transit is important. Of course, here's where it is today. Ridership to date, we are still about 57% down. This is average weekday boarding statewide. This is almost every single transit agency combined. When I was asked to provide this slide, I went and did a query with all 30 members that provide public transit, and I got about 28 of them to respond. Here's where we stand today. You can kind of see the curves up and down. Of course, dead of winter is always a kind of a lower ridership moment for folks. So quite a gap, quite a distance for us to recover. And we have a lot of work to do to figure out where these people are going and how they're doing. The ever-changing conditions through the pandemic, as we all know, because we all lived through it, was challenging. Wave after wave after wave after wave. We kind of, as a society, kept thinking, oh, this is the last wave. We're going to get through this and that's it. Well, we're coming down off of the biggest wave we've had yet with the Delta variant. And while I have confidence in the vaccine, we just don't know yet. Federal, state, and local, who's in charge? We had to deal with a lot of different mandates, a different guidance. We had Federal Transit Administration guidance come down. We worked very closely with the governor's office on the transit guidance that were released, weekly calls with his staff, making sure that we were able to work on that. And that is when we worked on the social distancing on the bus being 3 feet, not 6 feet, because there's a lot of research and examples across the world that worked. And of course, a lot of agencies struggled with different varying opinions by their local health officials. There might have been some counties that had sheriffs not enforcing face mask coverings. Of course, that's a federal mandate. It's still a federal mandate today on transport, airports, trains, and on buses. So we are impacted by that federal mandate. So we had to struggle with kind of marrying all the different mandates, who's in charge, who's what, who trumps who. Can a local health official kind of override what Governor Inslee has said or what the federal government has said as well? Mask mandates and the varied reaction caused trouble for our members. there are a lot of people that just don't want to wear a mask. It's a mandate on the bus. It's a mandate when you're in a transit facility, moving to and from your transportation. It's a challenge for our members, the drivers, the frontline workers having to kind of police that has been very troubling for them. And it's something that we need to be thankful that we've been working on. It's still a problem today. We've seen all of the coverage about the airline industry struggling with folks not wanting to wear a mask. It's not just an airline, it is across the board on all the transportation services of unruly passengers not wanting to follow the simple task of wearing your mask. Moving forward, continued safety protocols, daily cleanings, driver barriers, and vaccines. I'll get to vaccines in a moment. Service levels versus workforce needs. So right now, generally, we're about 90% level of service for folks. We have some agencies who are, I'm just looking at my data here, some agencies are below 80% of their original service levels. Most are at or around 90% of their original service levels. What we're starting to see now is lack of drivers applying for, getting them trained to drive. And that's actually causing some agencies to actually do a reduction in service because they're not meeting the trips. We would rather build reliability in our schedule to say the bus is going to come every 45 minutes instead of every 30 minutes because we don't want those folks to get a missed trip if we're getting into the winter time, and that's not good business. So some agencies are doing that. We're having struggles recruiting, retaining employees. This isn't a transit problem. This is a national workforce problem, particularly in the service industry. You're seeing it in restaurants, you're seeing it in the hotels, and every industry is really struggling to hire employees to work. And then the vaccine mandates may cause a temporary reduction in service. We've seen with the ferry system, I'm not quite sure if you've all talked about it, but it's not a hidden secret that the ferry system is missing trips because of workforce needs. Of course, the state mandate deadline came and gone, and there are some state employees that are no longer working for the state. Those mandates are also a problem for our workforce, but needed for our health and vitality of our economy. And then the future movement of people and goods is still unknown. We do not know how the workforce will come back, when they will come back, part-time versus full-time. So that makes it very hard for us to plan in the future. And we're working on it, but it just doesn't know. We don't know what service levels on certain routes. I'll just say an anecdotal, I'm working from my home. I don't go to Olympia anymore every day. I go in every other week or so. I make sure the place didn't burn down. I water my office plants, and I sign a few checks, and that's my job at in the office. But I use transit now locally to go downtown Tacoma and go get lunch, and so I think a lot of folks who work from home still need to utilize public transportation to go out through the day. And I hope that our employers see that the need for transit is still needed, even if their employees are working from home. There we go. Vaccine mandates are coming. Some agencies are already enforcing it. Intercity Transit, Sound Transit, King County Metro, and Community Transit and Pullman Transit. Intercity Transit was the first agency to implement the vaccine mandate outside of any other kind of force. So Sound Transit started doing it by virtue of them working in the state right of way and having several contracts with the state. King County Metro by virtue of Executive Constantine's order for all county employees. Community Transit just recently moved towards it. And Pullman Transit, ironically, this week we've been communicating last week, is they have such a huge contract with Washington State University, go Cougars, that it has, their state mandate is actually triggering the entire city of Pullman to start having to do it. I will say intercity transit's deadline was at 4 o'clock yesterday, and they almost reached 100% of all their employees being vaccinated. So I'm very proud of intercity transit and the work that they did to get that done. There is a federal mandate pending, however. All private and public entities of 100 plus employees will be impacted in the state. I think that's a little known fact that the public sector will be impacted. The federal mandate says that public or states with state OSHA plans will be impacted for public employees. There are 26 states and 2 territories that have OSHA plans like this, and Washington State is one of them. I will note last week in Governor Inslee's press release that when the state receives that, he will consider taking out the test out option. So the test out option is you can either get vaccinated or you can get weekly tested for it. The problem with that test out option is, frankly, it's very costly. The company has to pay for the time the employee takes to get the test, has to pay for the test. And so I think to kind of make it more simplified and kind of even across the field, it sounds like Governor Inslee is considering removing that and making it all that. So a lot of entities and a lot of our members will be impacted by this 100 plus employee mandate for vaccines. And so finally, kind of, we're working together. We're sharing ideas and issues. We as an association have hosted over nearly 250 various meetings over the last 2 years. We still meet twice a week as general managers, and we continue to hold webinars, virtual conferences, and meetings. I got this slide deck late to you all. In fact, you don't have it yet, and I'll send it after we had our virtual conference last week. We were going to have it in person, but we wanted to be a part of the solution, not the problem. We moved it virtual, and we had well over 200 attendees for that. A lot had to do with how we recover from the pandemic. I wanted to end with pictures of writers and services. I think it's really important to know that we can talk about data every day. We talk about ridership, and we talk about performance, and we talk about operations, and we metrics. We can get lost in the data, and we have to remember that every data point, there is a human face to it. There is a community activity to it. And so when we talk about ridership, when we talk about service levels, when we talk about fare box revenue, and we talk about sales tax, it's really about the people you see across the state in these pictures. And that's all I have for you. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I don't see any in the Q&A. So take it away, Mr. Chair.
All right, does there anybody have a question? Scroll
Great.
through to see.
I did such a great job. Nobody has questions. Perfect.
That's it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your guys' time.
Thank you, Justin. Now we'll hear from Robin. Please introduce yourself and take it away.
Thank you. My name is Robin Austin, and I work with King County Metro. I am the deputy lead of COVID recovery and response at Metro. This is the team that we set up to be able to make decisions related to COVID quickly and more effectively. So I am the deputy lead of that work. You had my counterpart came in July of last year, Hannah McIntosh, and so I'm here to give you an update on what she presented to you guys. So next slide. This is going to be a little bit, we're going to take what Kelly talked about and what Justin talked about, and we're going to go a little bit into detail about what happened here in King County for Metro. So the impacts of COVID-19 on our transit ridership clearly were great. It was quite a bit. And when we came in July of 2020, we had projections and ideas of what we thought was going to be a significant decrease and then a significant rebound. And we clearly now know that that is not the case with COVID, and that's not how that's going to respond. So what you'll see here is this is our average weekday boardings, and this is a percentage of change from the year previous. So those two gray lines that you see hovering right around 0% change, those are 2017, 2018, and 2019. And then that dark gray line that you see take that massive hit down in February, that is 2020. So that was where we saw that what Justin mentioned was about a 75% decrease in our ridership when things hit pretty fast and furious here in King County. We were one of the first counties in the country to really enter the pandemic and see that hit pretty quickly. So we lost about 75%. That means 25% of our riders, even during lockdown and even during the height of COVID, were still utilizing our transit service. So we were still providing a significant amount of service to those in most need. And then you'll see in 2021, this orange line, so this is a percentage of change over 2020. So come February, we started to see our first increase in ridership since the pandemic hit. And it is still an overall loss of riders, but we finally started to see people coming back to transit, coming back to work, and using transit to get to places that they needed to go. Sporting events are happening again. The Seahawks, the Mariners, events are starting to happen again. So we're starting to see some of that ridership return, but it's not returning in the way that we had necessarily thought it would at this time. So next slide. This is another way to look at it. This one's a little sadder, but that green line at the top, that is our baseline boardings per month. And this is 2019. So you'll see the blue line is where our current boardings are. We are significantly less, but also you'll see that is over 150,000 people a day. So that is not an insignificant amount of people that we are moving through our system every day. It is less, but it is still a lot of people. And you'll notice those three big dips that we see in our ridership. Those are Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day. And you'll see that the loss of ridership in those big holidays was a lot less than before, meaning that the users who are staying on our service, that 25, 30, 40%, depending on where we are really dependent on our service and do need it. So of the riders that are staying on our service, they are needing it more than our commuters and what we saw in the past. So next slide. The other thing we learned, we knew that we were probably going to lose the majority of our loss would be through commuter routes. But what we also saw was a significant geographic difference in where our ridership loss was. So if you see those blue routes that are up in the north and the east, those are the routes that saw the most decrease in ridership. So those were mostly our commuter routes. There was mostly a lot of our tech, a lot of our downtown workers who went remote and stopped coming in. And that's where we saw the greatest decrease in ridership. Those yellow routes that you see, that's where we saw the least amount of decrease in riders. And most of those are our all-day fixed network routes that serve a lot of our either lower income or essential workers. So we saw a significant, the loss was significantly less in those areas in South King County. And so that gave us a good idea of where we should be focusing the service hours that we had when we had to make cuts, but also where we should be restoring service quicker when we have those opportunities. So it was something I think we definitely knew about our ridership trends, but COVID gave us a lot of more insight of where people who need our service are using our service. So those were the trends that we saw as far as loss and ridership. Next slide. And then where is our current system today? So where are we after we had those losses? So this month in October, we were able to bring back 36 of our suspended routes and restore service to 48 routes that equaled almost 200,000 service hours. So this was our first big increase in service and our first step of bringing back service into the network. In April of this year, we also recalled all 200 of our part-time operators that had been laid off earlier in the pandemic. So we're starting to bring our service back. We're starting to bring our employees back. We need more employees, just like Justin mentioned. As much as other people are dealing with, we still need more drivers and more operators. But we were able to bring back everyone that we laid off who did want to return to work. So it was great to see that increase. And it was great this October in our service change to bring a significant increase back to our network. Metro service is one of the, what Jesse mentioned, in the higher amount. We are about 90% of our pre-pandemic levels and 11,400 bus trips each weekday. So again, this is not an insignificant amount of trips that we are excited that we can still serve and that we can still bring into our network. And then also this October, our transit agency partner, Sound Transit, opened 3 new light rail stations, significantly expanding the light rail network in King County. And we were able to provide a bus restructure to support those new light rail stations and to increase accessibility to the expanded light rail system. So not all is dark, not all is lost, and we are getting excited about the elements of transit that we were able to bring back and the investments we were able to continue to make as we regrow and build back our network. Next slide. Some of the responses that we did do during COVID to create a safe environment on our transit was enhanced cleaning for coaches and our facilities, including our bus stop stations, all those facilities. We are doing daily cleanings on our coaches now. And our plan is to keep most of these responses in long-term, if not permanent, knowing that transit needs to be a safe and secure place for our riders. Masks are required on Metro coaches. We actually implemented our mask mandate before the FTA and the feds did, so it was actually really good for us to get that support from the federal level. And we now provide masks on board all of our coaches. We have about an average of a 90% compliance with our masks on coach. So while we would love it to be 100, we are seeing significant compliance on our mask requirements on our coaches. We did install our safety partitions for our operators and our riders. Initially, when we put those in, they were made by a fabrication shop, and they were manual ones that the operators moved, but it was quick and we were able to put them in relatively easily. We've now automated those so they open as the door opens and closes, and our fabrication and vehicle maintenance shop was actually able to build those themselves and get those in relatively quickly. Again, that's going to be something that we look into the future if we choose to keep those in long term, but they've been a real success on board of our coaches. And upgraded airflow and filtration, upgrading the filters on our coaches. We also did health and safety studies to look at what window open close combination is the best for airflow and how we could, given the weather in Seattle and the rain and the cold and the warm, what HVAC window open combinations were the best so we can make sure that we can bring as much clean air onto our coaches as possible. So those are some of our safety, our health and safety on coaches that we do plan to most likely keep long term to keep the healthy environment on board our coaches. The next slide. Another really important element that we learned for the riders who were utilizing our service is they needed more information and more transparent information about what was going on the service. So we created a Power BI external facing dashboard that would give our riders the ability to look at where routes were canceled, where mask use by different routes, bus capacity, and where stops were missed. So it gave, in addition to just giving schedules, this was a dashboard that our public and the community could use to look at where impacts were seen and where mask usage was, where stops were being missed, to help also people make an educated decision on if and how and when they were going to use transit. We also wanted to be as upfront and transparent with the data we had about our response and our environment during COVID. So this dashboard allowed us to be able to do that for our community, and it is updated daily. Next slide. And then a big one, like Kelly mentioned, is our employer and business needs. So we do have an amazing Orca business passport program for employers of employees over 500. And we have been working with them very intensely during this last year to understand what we could do to keep them in the program through COVID. And that included changing some of our billing practices, and how we were working with them during that time, but also to be part of the conversations as they're starting to make decisions about bringing people back to work and how that's going to look. So we can make decisions with our transit service and understand what the trends are happening with our business partners. So we've done a lot of work with those accounts and being able to accommodate employers and businesses and continue to engage on their transit needs. A new effort that we're working on is focused on retaining and obtaining new business accounts, especially those small business, BIPOC-owned businesses, and those lower income earners. So those riders that we're seeing that are our 25% that are staying in our service, that live maybe further in South King County or other places, how are we reaching out to those employees and employers to create transit opportunities for them if they don't have 500 employees, if they have 5 or 6 or 10? What also can we do to actively engage with those employers and help support their employees as well? So that's a lot of the work that that team is going to be has started doing and will continue doing over the next year. And that was all I had for my presentation. So mine was significantly shorter than everyone else, but does anyone have any questions? I will add really quickly too, our vaccine mandate deadline was yesterday, and we have 93% of our over 3,000 workforce verified vaccinated. And we are now working with that 7% that we have left on options to either get vaccinated by December or retirement or other separation options.
Any questions?
No questions. Good presentation.
Must be background noise I'm hearing. Okay.
Thank you.
And while Robin was presenting, Amy from the WashDOT joined us, so I wanted to welcome her to the meeting today. She's still on, right?
Yes.
Cool. Next up is Axel.
Hey, Chairman Jennings, can you hear me okay?
Introduce yourself.
Well, I want to say thank you for allowing me to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit this afternoon about COVID-19 impacts on county road departments. My name is Axel Swanson. I'm the new managing director for the Association of County Engineers. And I do have quite a bit of background with counties. Most recently, I was a county manager. So this presentation, it might be a little bit shorter, but it's going to draw upon my experience kind of working through the pandemic as a leader at a county, and then more recent experience with my membership, county engineers, road departments, and kind of surveying them and getting a feel for what they're seeing still as it relates to COVID-19. You know, there's a lot of themes coming forward. You're going to hear them from me as well with the previous speakers. It was refreshing to hear Kelly and Justin and Robin's presentation, because as gloomy as this presentation is probably going to be, it's a reminder we're all facing this together. We're kind of in it together and trying to tackle the same problem. So a little quick background on counties. I know this is just a refresher for you guys with all the experience you have with the statewide transportation system, but I like to start here and talk to people about kind of what county road departments are responsible for and what we do. As you know, there's 39 counties. We are responsible for 39,000 centerline miles. That's roughly 60% of the total Washington roadways. Also, we're responsible for almost half of the bridges in Washington, and then we have 4 ferry systems. One other point I want to make came up in Justin's slide, and want to make that point here about counties too, is how kind of different our counties are, right? So we saw a presentation from King County, a neighboring county close to where I live, Wahkiakum County, very small geographically, has just over 4,000 in population. So, you know, our members are very different in what they kind of can bring to the table in terms of resources to respond and react. We all have the same mission and goals, but we're very different. So you can go ahead and go next slide if you like. So I kind of broke the current and ongoing challenges related to COVID-19 into four, I'll call them buckets. I wanted to start with our workforce, our employees. We provide a public service, and that starts with who works for us and with us to provide the service. And then I wanted to talk a little bit with the commission about our projects, trying to get projects out on the ground, preservation, maintenance, construction. And then you've heard also the theme of revenue. What are the changes in travel habits going to mean to our sort of usual revenue sources? And then I have this last slide, also a theme you've heard around uncertainty and where we're going moving forward. So go ahead, Bobby. So workforce challenges, impacts to our employees, and we've had a lot of tough decision making as managers. So you've already heard a lot about the changing guidance and mandates. That was no different for counties or county road departments. Started with the masking, distancing, quarantining. You know, I think talking to members, you know, we're in the routine as it relates to the masking and the distancing and things we've been dealing with for quite a while. You'll remember as people became vaccinated, we did some work around quarantining because there was this difference in, you know, who is a close contact and is there a different requirement for if you're vaccinated or not. I remember that being something we had to work through, you know, and all the different guidance that came out from the different levels, which has been discussed. The new one I'm hearing about from membership, there's been conversations and you've already heard today, is the vaccine mandates coming through. We've got some counties that have vaccine mandates. They're talking about and wondering how it's going to potentially impact the service they provide and their ability to do that. I don't need to talk too much about it. It's in the news right now, but it is a concern for road departments. You can see, you know, the season's changing. The leaves are falling. We've got standing water. It's getting colder. We're going to start seeing snow and ice. It's very important to our members to be staffed up and ready to get to work out there. And so any reduction in the workforce is going to be of concern. And my next bullet also has already been discussed about our members in county road departments. We're having a real tough time with the hiring and the turnover and just the ability to fill these shortages in drivers and equipment operators. So same problems many are facing are true for us as well. And a possible reduction in workforce, you know, could exacerbate that. All these kind of changing guidance and mandates, this stuff, you know, we work with our bargaining groups. And so kind of on the management side, we've really had to work closely and work quickly and sometimes in complex situations. And so as things change, we have that responsibility to work within our contracts and with our members. And so that's something that I know has been going on and continues to go on as things change, is to have that working relationship and sometimes respond quickly. And then I didn't want to leave this off. And like I said, some of this is a little gloomy, but this, we've all experienced this. Is the COVID-19 is not just at work. It comes home. It's all with you kind of all the time. So there's this prolonged stress and fatigue that I'm hearing, you know, and have experienced personally with our membership, and we all feel it. And I think it's, you know, anecdotally, I haven't done an official survey, but I think my experience as a county manager has led me to believe there's an increased level of personnel issues. You know, it's this stress, it's the fatigue. I'm hearing from members that as they're out doing road projects, it feels more dangerous. There's this, you know, there's generally more anger or people are driving faster or more erratic. And so there's just sort of this ongoing issue of prolonged stress and fatigue and how that rolls over at work. Go ahead. So some construction challenges. You know, you're going to hear more about some of this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but certainly we're having some impacts to construction maintenance and operation. So disrupted supply chains for equipment and supplies. It's harder to get everything from computers to pickup trucks, gravel, you know, everything you need to kind of do a lot of projects. I think I sent a link to a King 5 story that was done about Thurston County. They had to put off like 90% of their road striping program this year because they couldn't get the paint. So just things like that are going on all over the state with county road departments. I mentioned increased costs for materials, so we've all seen the news about inflation and what's going on. That's obviously a big deal for our projects, because when you add costs, you start having challenging discussions with your contractors, and it gets difficult overseeing those contracts. You're going back to check what the language says, and you're talking about change orders. And when you're talking about change orders, you're talking a lot of times to the Board of Commissioners or the decision makers about why. So it kind of wraps itself into this, complex procurement and contracting decisions. You kind of got to do some of that work up front. Are we going out with this project? Is it possible? Can we get the supplies we need? Will we get, what kind of bids will we get back? Will they be too high or over the engineer's estimate? You're kind of thinking through all that stuff up front, and sometimes it's either prolonging or postponing projects altogether. And then I wanted just to throw this in there too, just as it related to my employees and staff and people I work with every day. We're doing all this in a time when we have these other things going on. We have the heat dome or whatever you call it this summer. We have wildfire smoke. And so all this is going on, and then these other things come into play, and it just kind of builds on itself and continues to be difficult. Go ahead. Some revenue challenges you heard in the other presentations. So things shifted and changed dramatically with travel habits, and so counties, we do receive gas tax from the state. So we saw decreases in direct distributions of gas tax because there was less gas tax coming in. A lot of grant programs counties rely on depend on gas tax, so you could see a decrease in grants or a delay in the cycle because the revenue wasn't there. At the same time, it's kind of this double-edged sword a little bit. We've got this influx of American Rescue Plan Act funding coming in. And so all of a sudden you have a lot of money potentially coming that can be used for public works infrastructure, water, sewer, and broadband specifically. But those, a lot of counties do utility services, and we're used to working with water and sewer, not so much broadband. But suddenly you have this influx of funding that you can put in those areas. Doesn't necessarily mean you're staffed up and have the capacity to expand those programs. And so I think that was mentioned earlier, but a lot of counties are working on that, trying to make sure they're ready to get that money out there in those areas. And I already mentioned the hiring issues and how difficult that can be. That also comes with some new and more complicated audit requirements. So, you got county finance departments and public works finance departments, making sure that as you do get new revenue, you're meeting all the requirements there. And then the last bullet I put there is uncertainty about a state and federal infrastructure package. Lots of talk about that. I think it's a really exciting time to be in transportation because those conversations are going on. We're optimistic, but we don't know exactly when or how that's going to happen. Go ahead. And then I just finished with this slide, and we've talked about it, but it's this impact of uncertainty. We're all wondering how these travel habits, as they've changed, how long they're going to last. How long those impacts will continue on the system, how long the travel habits will change or impact our traditional sources of revenue. Should we forecast different, plan our projects different? There's just a lot of uncertainty. We are receiving some one-time federal funding, but what happens when that's gone? And then this big question, is county, my plug I'll put in for county road funds is they're property tax based. And as we know in Washington, property tax is capped at 1%. And so the inflation issue right now, we're concerned about and we're paying a lot of attention to, because if you see 5-6% inflation in your products that you need to do projects, then obviously the property tax is not going to be able to keep up with that, and that's going to be doing more with less down the road. So that is a big one for us that we're watching right now. And I think that's kind of where I ended. So I'll answer any questions you might have.
Are there any questions? No questions. You're off the hook.
There was one in chat. I'm trying to check here. I would say yes. That's a kind of a short answer, but I was trying to, I understand the question, and I guess the answer would be yes, our groups and folks we're working with are planning beyond that.
Any other questions before he leaves? Seeing none. Axel, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Now we'll hear from Brandy. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brandy Dilling. I am the newest addition to the AWC lobby team. Like Axel, I want to take a few moments to introduce myself and give you guys kind of a quick overview of who I am and where I come from. I joined AWC back in July, so last year when you saw this presentation, you likely saw it from one of our contract lobbyists as well as our legislative analyst at the time. And so you may see some repeat of information, but I did want to create some continuity. But moving forward, I am the primary lobbyist for the transportation infrastructure and telecom portfolio. So, you know, I kind of want to do the same thing that Axel did, which is give you guys a quick overview of, you know, city infrastructure, or excuse me, city transportation infrastructure, where we get our funding and how it's, you know, allocated out. So kind of one of the key issues here, of course, is that we too have 25,000 lane miles, which is approximately 26%, excuse me, of all of the statewide travel lanes. What this really means, though, is that a good majority of folks that are traveling throughout the state are traveling on city roads. And, you know, that means that all of the funding that we get, whether it's local, state, or federal, is really put towards trying to create a maintenance and preservation program that actually is long-term and sustainable. Just a couple of key data points for you all to recognize is that, you know, 79% of that funding is coming from the local level. So it's coming from property tax, sales and use tax, and B&O tax, and perhaps utility tax in some cases. Only 13% really comes from any state funding sources. So these are programs like TIB or FMCIB or our gas tax distributions. And then, of course, a very small percentage of it is coming from the federal level. You know, I think that the big piece too with the federal level is that oftentimes we find that we are in a situation where we're kind of struggling to hit matching funds. And so a lot of our folks are really trying to figure out where their funding sources are going to come from and how to create a sustainable approach to maintaining those lane miles. Go ahead to the next slide, please. All right, so I think this is a really neat infographic. It kind of demonstrates in a more comprehensive fashion the total responsibility that a city has when it comes to our transportation system. So, you know, as you can kind of see here, we don't just do streets. We do everything from maintaining bike lane miles to making sure that conduit and right-of-ways are being adequately addressed. And we're also ensuring that things like landscaping and ADA compliance comes into play. And so this is a real balancing act between all of the work that we need to do with the true infrastructure of actual roads, in addition to all of the things that we kind of take for granted when we're driving down the road. And then, of course, this issue of trying to balance all of these needs is kind of compounded by the fact that there's a huge structural funding gap. And oftentimes cities have to really prioritize what their preservation is going to look like and where they're going to do some of that additional work, for instance, around ADA compliance or around landscaping or around updating their street lights and other things in that category. Go ahead and move forward, please. So, you know, I think one of the key things here that we're seeing in this graph is the four main expenditures of cities. So we can really kind of break it down into 4 categories, which is capital preservation, maintenance and operation, administration, like basic overhead, and then of course the other miscellaneous issues that we have going on. Breaking these down even further, we see that obviously there's a structural deficit going on, and that maintenance and operation costs are going to continue to grow regardless of any additional support that we see from the state or federal level, or even what we can generate at the local level. So again, this is the moment where we're trying to balance the needs of our citizens while also kind of keeping things moving forward, for lack of a better analogy. The other thing I want to kind of note is that a couple of years ago, the GTC did an assessments need and found that there's about 900 million or more that's going to be needed in spending to kind of take care of that funding gap with preservation and maintenance. So it's pretty expansive, and it's something that is constantly at the forefront of what our membership is thinking about when they're trying to address their overall needs. Go ahead and move forward, please. So what does this really mean in terms of COVID-19 and where we're currently at in the pandemic? A couple of key things, I think this has been said before, but the pandemic is not over yet. So I know that while some of the information that was presented last year was kind of maybe framed in the sense of this is where we're at, we're trying to move forward, and perhaps we'll see the light at the end of the tunnel. I think we're now in a position of trying to figure out how to treat this in a way as the new normal. One of the key things that we found last year in 2020 is that 42% of our cities really indicated that state investment into their transportation systems was a top priority. But, kind of in light of this too, we were all expecting really significant declines in revenue. And this, of course, has been said before, but the decrease in fuel taxes was a huge issue. And of course, this caused our folks to either cancel or postpone a lot of their projects in November as a way to kind of offset those huge deficits that they were experiencing and or expecting to happen. And then the other piece to all of this is that a lot of our folks were also really considering dipping into their capital reserves just so that they could make ends meet, and again, kind of create this continuity of services the best that they could for their citizens. I think one of the things, though, looking ahead, just kind of briefly, is that the good news is the state budget overall is in a significantly better place than it was last year. So I think that does give us a little hope, but by no means do I want to give the feel that we're out of the woods just yet. Next slide, please. So broken down a little bit further, I think one of the things that we're trying to highlight here is just the amount of uncertainty associated with our revenues as well. Again, like I say, I think we saw that there was a huge decline in ridership. We saw that revenues as a whole were declining as well, which is something that we've been trying to really respond to. And that also means that grants and other funding mechanisms that we've been using just haven't been available as much, just because there's just not enough revenue for these programs to be fully funded. Next slide, please. So in this last year, we went ahead and we also did another city conditions survey to really kind of get a sense of where our membership is through the pandemic, and also just in general. When we originally sent out our initial surveys, the projected response from our folks in experiencing some sort of revenue loss or reduction in their overall budgets was between 5 and 15%. So that's pretty staggering. And it was something that I think, it was 52%, and they are expecting a 5 to 15% reduction, which is fairly staggering. It's something that I think a lot of folks were really trying to anticipate and try to budget accordingly, which is really hard when, of course, some of these revenue sources can be so volatile, like gas tax. Next slide, please. So we were able to do a follow-up, and the good news on this is that only 36% of our membership actually experienced that 5 to 15% reduction. So, good news, it wasn't the 52% that we had originally anticipated, but bad news, a significant amount of our folks did in fact realize a pretty large reduction in their revenues, which of course means that there's huge impacts and a balancing act that has to occur again in making sure that transportation is prioritized in addition to other essential city services. Go ahead and next slide, please. So I think this chart here really kind of does a nice job of showing exactly how our folks responded to create that continuity of services. What you'll see predominantly is that a lot of our members decided that reducing or eliminating programs, reducing or eliminating travel altogether, and then also canceling capital projects was something that they were going to do and did do in order to create a bit of a balancing act because of those revenue reductions. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So this, I think, kind of really breaks it down in a better sense. So we saw 48% of our folks saying, yep, they got rid of travel. And then we also saw, I think, where you can see a pretty large number here is 31% of our folks said, yep, we're going to use our operating reserves to keep things afloat. And again, I can't stress this enough. It wasn't, a decision that was made easily by our membership. This was so that essential services could be maintained. And unfortunately, that means that, like I say, those preservation and maintenance projects, or even some of the additional projects that are, kind of supplemental, if you will, got put on the back burner or just entirely taken off the table because they no longer rose to the top of needs through this pandemic. Go ahead and the next slide, please. So, I think the other key thing that has been identified throughout this process and throughout the pandemic as a whole is how do we respond? And of course, one of the things that comes to the forefront of our membership is we in fact need an increased funding source that's specifically dedicated for transportation, preservation and maintenance. That really means that we need those competitive grant programs that are already in existence, like TIB and FMCIB, to be fully funded so that we can actually use those programs to address some of the needs at the local level that otherwise are being put on the back burner or unfortunately taken off the table entirely. The other thing that kind of came to light here, and I think this is frankly a benefit of COVID, is the needs around equity and equitable-based transportation, whether that's multimodal capital investments, different types of access to transit as a whole. This is really kind of at the forefront of our membership's thought process, and as a result of that, AWC has now begun to put together and will soon publish equity resource toolkit, where it really kind of breaks down not only transportation needs, but everything from basic budgeting and funding issues to housing needs to just about any function of city government that can and should be looked through an equity-based lens. The other piece, and I think Axel also mentioned this, and it's kind of taking us backwards for a second, but this is all, dedicated funding sources and competitive grant programs are also in the wake of any federal transportation or infrastructure package that may come down. Everything that we expect or hope to happen, of course, is always in flux because who knows what Congress will do. If we hold our breath, we may turn blue. And so I think this is one of those moments where we just simply have to cross our fingers and hope that something actually gets passed. But in the meantime, we have to focus our efforts at the state level and really remind people that those dedicated funding sources are imperative for us to actually provide the transportation needs that our folks are seeing at the local level. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So, this kind of brings us a full circle moment to the 2022 session. Our membership has identified 3 key issues, but 2 of them rise to the level of transportation. So, of course, supporting a new transportation revenue package is very important to us. And of course, that focus on preservation and maintenance and making sure that there's an equitable level of local funding is our top priority. And then secondarily, because we do recognize the necessity of local funding mechanisms as well, we want to expand authority around transportation benefit districts so that we can allow our folks to go beyond the two 10-year term limits that are currently authorized in statute. And so we really think that these 2 priorities coupled together will help us address some of those preservation and maintenance needs and beyond at the local level, at the city level. The other thing I just want to kind of note lastly too is that in all of this, we're very thoughtful about how we can continue to respond to COVID, how we can continue to respond to just basic equity needs as well. Our membership continuously wants to prioritize these issues. And of course, once that equity toolkit is published, I'd be happy to share it out with this group. I'm sure that there would be some interest in seeing what that looks like as a resource and as a guide for other folks. So with that, this is my presentation and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions? Carl.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Brandy. Nicely done. And even if it's some of it we heard before, it's good to hear it again and to see the new context. On the projected impacts to city revenues compared to actually realized, you spoke to the 5 to 15% reduction chunk, but I'm interested in knowing a little more about the more than 15% reduction response that went from 13.7% to 25%. And is that seems concerning in its own right? And is there some information on, are those like large different size cities, or some information on how that's breaking out?
Yeah, so it's definitely a cross section of our entire membership. It's not just large urban cities who are had that expected decrease in revenues. It was a full cross section of the membership. I think the other thing to kind of highlight here is that some of our smaller folks, even a significant drop in like dollar amounts is a significant number in overall reductions, right? So just to kind of put it in a scale, $1 may not actually be $1 for a smaller community. It could be a 10 to 15 to 20% reduction, right? Because they have a significantly smaller operating budget.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right then. Thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Chris, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, Chair Litt and members of the Transportation Commission. I'm Chris Herman.
Did we lose you?
Mr. Chair, this is Tamara. It looks, oh, wait, he just popped back on. And I think he accidentally muted himself. Chris, if you can hear us, we cannot hear you.
Okay, I'm back on. I cannot share my screen. So I think if you could, there we go. Thank you very much for that. And there we go. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you again for inviting me back. I think one thing I recall from this presentation about a year ago was that I talked about how anecdotal, and I'm not as a planner and someone who is typically very science and proof based. I'm not somebody who deals with anecdotal very well, but I feel like I'm back here again doing it because we are really at least for port districts, we're really in the thick of some challenging times. So I also recognize that Commissioner Bowman was with you this morning, and I hope that my presentation is able to build on hers, and so that you find the information helpful. So my first slide here is really about where we were a year ago, or March of 2020. Ports very early on were deemed essential. And so a lot of our activities, certainly goods movement activities, the airport operations were deemed essential. And so we also participated very early on with the governor's task force to really make sure that construction projects were able to continue in a safe manner. And so actually many of our ports had very short delays, if any delay at all, in execution of projects that they were working on at the time. So again, we continued to serve in a safe manner. Some of this might be a little redundant, but we worked through issues of access to personal protective gear, to make sure that folks were able to continue their jobs in a safe manner. Again, we worked on safety protocols for construction projects to make sure those could continue. Ports in the meantime have partnered. You at one time could have gotten tested as well as gotten a vaccination at SeaTac International Airport. And so we've had locations across the state. The Port of Grays Harbor had a vaccination site at one of their facilities in Aberdeen. So, and then we also, one thing that was very promising within the communities that participated. Many ports also act as their ADOs in economic development locally. And so using the governor's strategic reserve account for economic development, many ports also threw in money into that bucket and were out receiving applications about what needs were present for local small businesses to either reopen or maintain or stay open. And so we have a lot of stories and real proof of the good work that our members were doing to make sure that the economy continued to move along in their communities. Let's see here. There we go. So where we are today, and this was a good infographic. There's actually quite a few good infographics because there's so much discussion right now about supply chain disruption and the role that ports currently play in that. So this is undoubtedly a infographic that was produced by the Association of American Railroads. And I thought it was really interesting in that it really does sort of give you the process map.
Did we lose him again?
It appears so.
Well, let's take a couple minutes and let's see if he logs back on. There he is.
Sorry about that, folks. Let me pick up where I left off.
Chris, you may want to turn your video feed off, maybe just to help save some bandwidth on your end, perhaps. I'm not sure, but.
All right.
Trying.
So I'm not sure.
So we lost him again?
Yeah, it appears he's got some issues with his video feed. I'm thinking if we can get him to turn his camera off, that might help. I don't know if sharing screen though creates another bandwidth issue or not.
Do we have his presentation?
Unfortunately, we do not. He
Okay.
didn't finish it until sometime.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, would you like to take an early break? And we'll
I
see if
would.
we can connect with Chris.
Sounds good. Let's take a 10-minute break. Be back at 2:51.
Okay, thanks.
Connection issue with my internet.
Okay. So let's go ahead and reconvene. Bobby, if you will.
Okay, we're ready on this end.
And Chris, you're up again.
Great. Well, thank you. And sorry for a connection. I guess maybe we should, I should have included broadband here in my presentation, as that is certainly an issue and something ports are working on as well. So to jump back in again to the slide, sort of showing where we've come through COVID. Factory shutdowns led to parts shortages, shipping delays. We now have a demand curve that is really pressuring production as well as our distribution networks. There's insufficient equipment availability. That's throughout really the supply chain, whether it's container boxes or rail equipment or trucks or truck drivers. And of course, I addressed the labor availability and shortages. And we're back now to factory shutdowns. And so I sort of purposely wanted to show that you run full circle when you have parts that are missing and really don't allow for the things that we all want and need to be produced. And so I thought this was a good slide to show that. You could advance to the next slide. So this slide I took from the American Association of Port Authorities, and it's pretty heavy. There's a lot on here, but it does really describe in another way where we are with relationship to our supply chain disruption. So again, on the left, we see extreme spending and demand. We are remodeling our homes. We are making our backyards nicer. We are installing home gyms or buying home gym equipment as a safety precaution. There are many things that we're doing that weren't probably on individual businesses' mindsets in 2019 that are causing us to begin to increase or expand business in ways that just simply wouldn't have been identified. The next column, it talks a little bit about the factory shutdowns and what's really behind some of that. Certainly from the countries that do much of the production. Shipping volatility, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit in a future slide as far as some of the changes that we're seeing that may really be actually leading to long-term changes in how goods are shipped and moved about. So we have certainly port worker shortages. That is less prevalent here in the Northwest. It's more prevalent in other locations. But certainly, I think if you had the Washington Trucking Association here presenting today, they would certainly talk about a truck driver shortage. And we certainly see issues and shortages even in the pilotage, as an example. There are challenges having people in the right places at the right time to be able to maintain a cohesive goods movement. Container scarcity, we always talk, we talk a lot about that here at Washington Ports because we rely on those containers so much in relationship to exporting the state's goods back to other countries. Again, trucking, and then on the air cargo side, of course, we see fewer international flights, which if that is where your customers are located, as an exporter, you're needing to find either new customers in a place you can get your goods to, or in some cases you're having to go out and charter flights to meet that demand. Next slide. So we did see action from President Joe Biden last week, and indeed he's been thinking about the supply chain all year. And certainly he had an executive action in February of this year, which was designed to increase competition in markets with small businesses that have maintained large market shares. But last week, October 13th, he worked with both the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, as well as labor there. And they are looking to sustain consistent 24/7 operations. We also see that request, or the discussions certainly that the president is having, is related to large retailers like Amazon and Walmart, as well as parcel carriers, UPS and FedEx, to also expand those services. And you'll see again that those are really keys to making sure that you're not just kind of moving the delay to the next the next cog in the wheel, that you're really looking to solve the problem and get goods to their final destination. Next slide. So here's just a few reactions. We provide a couple quotes here from the president, as well as John Wolf, the CEO of the Northwest Seaport Alliance, which manages the marine terminal operations for both the Port of Seattle and the Port of Tacoma. And then Pete Buttigieg, as the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation, has also weighed in on creating resiliency in port infrastructure. And I'll talk a little bit at the end of my presentation about ways that that we are looking forward to position ourselves to make improvements to manage through these types of crises better in the future. Next slide. So digging in a little bit deeper in this, I don't have the reference on here. This is a gateway performance report that the Northwest Seaport Alliance puts together, and this one is, I think, is particularly interesting in that it shows vessels that are waiting to get into the port up and down the West Coast. And I went back to July on this and did every 2 weeks or so, and you'll see for sure the increase in vessels waiting. Obviously, we were at a low of 42 back in the end of July. And we're with the advent of the typical increase in shipping that coincides with Christmas shopping, we're now seeing just shy of 100 vessels collectively off of the West Coast. So I think this also sort of denotes a significant size difference, and certainly I think why the president focused his attention on LA Long Beach. We do know they handle about 40% of the container traffic in the entire US, but certainly they've had a large jump in the mid part of September. Next slide. And so another data point that the Northwest Seaport Alliance tracks is what's known as weekly train starts. And so we know into our gateway about 55% of those containers coming in will go immediately onto a rail car. And much of that, as you can see, heads to Chicago or other Midwestern locations. And then 45% of those inbound containers goes either somewhere locally or also goes perhaps to a warehouse located maybe in the Kent Valley. And that is then either distributed locally or gets into a domestic truck and then heads over to one of the railroads, rail yards for furtherance. So as far as the starts that are immediately at either port, we see actually a really consistent number here, but I thought it was interesting to show, to give folks a bit of a perspective. Now, a future slide, I'll talk about some action that one of the Class 1 railroads, Union Pacific, took. That was actually just prior to this. And so we did see a downturn as the railroad embargoed movements. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. Next slide. So again, a few anecdotes. I just talked about Union Pacific embargoing all West Coast intermodal traffic for 2 weeks. They had the backlogs had shifted to their terminals, mostly in the Chicago area. And so to deal with that, they just said, we're going to stop bringing additional containers in there until we can work through the backlog. And so that's one strategy, certainly that one private entity took to try to alleviate the problem. Another very interesting strategy, which I do think probably has some longer term impacts to shipping, is we have retailers now that have gone out and purchased their own international shipping containers. Up until this point, those containers have all been owned by the marine terminal or the marine vessel operators themselves, the ocean-going carriers. And so for the very first time, we see Amazon and Walmart specifically now in this space. And so what that allows them then to be able to do is to charter their own vessels because they own that equipment. And it gives them greater control over their supply chains. So a result of this is we now have the Port of Everett receiving a not insignificant amount of container shipping through that port. And so this is certainly an opportunity for some of our other ports across this, up and down the I-5 or the West Coast to potentially look at some of this volume. And it is one of the things certainly we'll be watching as we come out of this. This is something that certain shippers begin to see as a value add for them in their businesses. I already talked a little bit about the air cargo aspect, and then something we're always cognizant of because 85% of the exports come from a 3-state area in containers, and having enough container availability, as a lot of these containers lag with imports sitting in them, and then they go right back to the ship empty. And so what that means is our domestic our domestic producers, our agricultural commodities aren't getting into them. And so they're not, it's certainly causing challenges for those companies and those entities to get their products to market. Next slide. So overcoming our challenges, one thing we talk quite a bit about is that this crisis is really exacerbating really what has been underlying challenges, certainly for Washington State port districts, and probably specifically our container ports as far as it goes. Of Seattle. That project is going to increase certainly efficiency and allow for greater throughput through that particular gateway. And so there are certainly port infrastructure projects all over the state at many of our port districts that help those ports to do what they do better and to better serve their customers. I talked a little bit about competitiveness. Labor shortage is a significant issue. I'm sure you've heard a significant amount related to this today. And we are, it's not uncommon at this point for ports to be talking to their local, certainly their local community colleges on workforce development and understanding where the gaps are for their tenants, for their customers, and being able to look at and find ways to address that. And certainly we have a good example is the Maritime High School in South Seattle as an example. And there are others across the state. Ports as good neighbors, whether you're in Georgetown or the city of SeaTac or the Fruit Valley neighborhood in Vancouver, you have certainly communities that are, that you have BIPOC communities, you have certainly areas where you can improve and provide opportunities to disadvantaged communities and ways to increase equity and inclusion in the way you do your work. And that is something all ports are working on. The Port of Vancouver, as an example, has just recently completed a planning effort on how they can begin to increase their awareness and provide more opportunities for neighborhoods. And certainly that also goes for projects that we do and making sure that we're being more responsive and being good neighbors to the communities that are around us. Trade and tariff issues continue to be an issue. We have not had any significant changes with the new administration around our tariff policy, particularly with China. And in fact, in some cases, the relationship has perhaps worsened. So those continue to be challenges for Washington State businesses that rely on exporting. And land use. I don't want to overstate it, but we continue to have challenges, and obviously there are a lot of discussions in the legislature around land use opportunities, or looking at the state's policy around land use, and that is certainly something that's very interesting for port districts. We know that with the advent of e-commerce, we need 2 to 3 times as much storage space as e-commerce has moved to next day, that those facilities need to be closer to their customers. And this We are taxing the availability of commercial and industrial lands, particularly in our larger metropolitan areas in the state. And so there's significant concern that limits the ability for that land for manufacturing or for other important uses. I think that's my last slide. Is that my last slide? I don't think I put my contact slide, so I need to send you all that information if you need it. Again, I thank you for the opportunity today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions? Nope. No questions.